Identify this road sign.
That is a stop sign. Good catch. That is a no parking sign. You can't fail this one. That is a school zone sign. That is a speed limit sign. That is a turn left sign. Well done. That is a roundabout sign.
What road sign is this?
That is the yield sign. Nicely recognized. That is a no left turn sign. Yes, it is a pedestrian's crossing sign. Great job. That is a construction ahead sign. That is a curve right sign. That is a bike lane sign.
Which traffic sign is this?
Yes, it is. That is a do not enter sign. That is a no U-turn sign. That is a school bus stop ahead sign. That is a traffic light ahead sign. Well done. That is a one-way right sign. Good observation. That is a slippery when wet ahead sign.
Name this road sign.
That is a wrong way sign. That is a no right turn sign. Good catch. That is a workers ahead sign. That is a stop sign ahead sign. Nicely spotted. That is a keep right sign. That is a bump sign.
Which road sign is shown?
Nicely done. That is a no stopping sign. That is a two-way traffic sign. That is a deer crossing sign. That is a yield sign ahead sign. That is a turn right sign. Good catch. That is a detour ahead sign.
What is this road sign?
That is a right turn only sign. That is a railroad crossing crossbuck sign. That is a tow-away zone sign. That is a speed limit ahead sign. That is a curve left sign. Nicely done. That is a flagger ahead sign.
Can you name this road sign?
That is a left turn only sign. Nicely spotted. That is a road narrows sign. That is a school speed limit ahead sign. That is a hospital sign. That is a merge left sign. Well done. That is a slow sign.
Identify this traffic sign.
That is a straight through only sign. Great job. That is a no pedestrian crossing sign. That is a railroad crossing ahead sign. That is a cattle crossing sign. That is a lane ends merge right sign. That is a gasoline sign.
Which traffic sign do you see?
That is a one-way left sign. Exactly right. That is a no trucks sign. That is a falling rocks sign. That is a crossroad sign. Nicely done. That is a weight limit sign. That is a camping sign.
What road sign do you see?
That is a keep left sign. Nicely spotted. That is a no left turn on red sign. That is a steep grade hill sign. Great job. That is a T intersection sign. That is a lodging sign. That is a bear crossing sign.
What road sign is this?
That is a lane ends merge left sign. Well done. That is a truck route sign. That is a narrow bridge sign. That is a do not drive on tracks sign. That is a reverse curve right sign. That is a parking area sign.
Name this traffic sign.
That is a no right turn on red sign. That is a Y intersection sign. Excellent awareness. That is a rough pavement ahead sign. That is an airport sign. Excellent. That is a reverse curve left sign. Excellent awareness. That is a food sign.
Which road sign is this?
That is a no U-turn or left turn sign. That is a winding road sign. Good observation. That is a diesel fuel sign. That is a side road left sign. That is a bus station sign. That is a divided highway begin sign.
What is this traffic sign?
Great job! That is a no street through sign. That is a dip sign. Yes, it is the handicapped sign. Exactly right. That is a wild horse sign. That is a traffic merges from right sign. That is a telephone sign.
Can you name this traffic sign?
Excellent. That is a low clearance sign. That is a crosswind sign. That is an added right lane sign. That is a train station sign. Right again. That is a divided highway end sign. Well done. That is a no hitchhiking sign.
Identify this road sign.
That is a bicycle route sign. Good catch. That is a tourist information sign. That is a truck height limit sign. That is a pedestrians permitted sign. That is an added left lane sign. That is a library sign.
What does this road sign mean?
That is an electric vehicle charging sign. That is a no bicycles sign. Nicely done. That is a playground zone sign. Good catch. That is a reverse turn right sign. That is a hazardous material route sign. That is a parking fee station sign.
What is this road sign?
That is a bicycles permitted sign. Good observation. That is a right shoulder drop-off ahead sign. That is a narrow underpass sign. That is a trailer camping sign. That is an emergency vehicle sign. That is a Chevron right sign.
Name this road sign.
Nicely recognized. That is a snowmobile sign. That is a park ride sign. That is a bike route sign. Excellent awareness. That is an equestrian sign. That is a no parking on pavement sign. That is a bicycle lane end sign.
Which road sign is shown?
That is a hairpin curve right sign. That is an alternative fuel compressed natural gas sign. That is a national network route sign. That is a handicapped accessible sign. That is a keep right of obstacle sign. That is a Chevron left sign.
What road sign is this?
That is a U.S. route marker 2-digit sign. That is a no snowmobile sign. That is a bicycle and pedestrian sign. That is a single lane transition sign. That is a no parking on bridge sign. That is a forest route sign.
Identify this traffic sign.
Yes, it is a hazardous material prohibited sign. That is a keep left of obstacle sign. Well done. That is a local bicycle route sign. Right again. That is a no equestrian sign. That is an interstate route marker 2-digit sign. Nicely recognized. That is a double lane shift right sign.
Which traffic sign is this?
That is a do not pass stopped train sign. That is a pull through sign. Nicely done. That is a bicycle slippery when wet ahead sign. That is a motorcycle plaque sign. That is a national network prohibited sign. Good observation. That is a roundabout circulation plaque sign.
Can you identify this road sign?
That is a U.S. bicycle route sign. Yes, it is a skater's permitted sign. Excellent. That is a state route marker 2-digit sign. Exactly right. That is a hill bike sign. That is a no parking on track sign. That is a vehicle ferry terminal sign.
What is this road sign?
Excellent. That is a bicycle's merging sign. Good catch. That is an equestrian's permitted sign. That is a U.S. route marker 3 digits sign. That is a traffic signal photo enforced sign. That is a bicycle parking area directional sign. That is a no all-terrain vehicle sign.
Which traffic sign do you see?
That is an interstate route marker 3-digit sign. Excellent. That is a litter container sign. That is a straight through and left turn sign. Great job. That is a horse-drawn vehicles sign. Nicely done. That is a county route marker sign. That is a no parking bike lane sign.
Which traffic sign do you see?
That is a truck rollover warning right sign. That is a farm vehicles sign. That is an interstate route marker with state 2-digit sign. Exactly right. That is a ramp speed advisory sign. That is a no skater sign. That is a golf cart sign.
Which traffic sign do you see?
That is an off-interstate business route marker sign. Good observation. That is a no parking bus stop sign. That is a low ground clearance crossing sign. That is a no pedestrian sign. Good observation. That is a curve with crossroad right sign. That is an exit speed sign.
Which traffic sign do you see?
That is a combination junction 2 route signs. That is a no right turn for truck sign. That is a curve with side road right sign. That is a no parking 8:30 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. sign. That is a narrow two-way traffic sign. Nicely spotted. That is a passenger-only ferry terminal sign.
Which traffic sign do you see?
That is a curve with tangent right sign. That is an interior lane shift right sign. Exactly right. That is a double side roads right sign. That is an Exit Gore no exit number sign. That is a 270-degree loop curve right sign. Nicely done. That is an offset side roads left and right sign.
And that's a wrap. You just crushed road signs like a pro. Hit subscribe for more and drive safe out there. See you next time.